And welcome back to America Can We Talk, and thank you so much for tuning in tonight. I mentioned before the break we have a fabulous guest joining us. He's joining us by phone, and I want to just quickly introduce him. His name is Richard Higgins, or Rich Higgins, and his resume, reads like someone you think, gosh, I'd love to have him in charge of the country. He's currently the Vice President of Intelligence and National Security for a group called RED LLC. But his life experience, he's an expert in the nexus between theological doctrines and information age unconventional warfare. He spent 20 years combating terrorism. He managed a classified project for Special Operations Command, SOCOM. From 2010 to 2011, he served as the chair of Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict. I could go on and on. This is a gentleman just well-versed, deeply well-versed, not just in the methods of war, but in a unique way, well-versed and understanding of the ideological roots that are undergirding the battles we face today. So, Rich Higgins, did I come close to accurately describing your expertise? And hello.
Too kind, Debbie. Thanks for having me tonight. It's good to talk to you again.
I'm so happy to have you on, and that you, as you say, you were on the show one time before. So Rich Higgins wrote this memo, and the title of it is POTUS and Political Warfare, is dated, and POTUS being President of the United States, and Political Warfare, May 2017. Okay, so I have to tell you that we were on vacation, and so we took a little bit of a break, and we were out in California, and my husband came across this, and so we were on vacation with printed out copies of this, highlighting and writing all over it, because it's a brilliant memo, and I want our listeners to understand. As I was preparing for today, I was thinking I need about 3 hours to talk through all this with you, but the gist of what you were writing about, I took it to be that it was important for the president and for H.R. McMaster, the National Security Council, to understand that all of these attacks on President Trump are not just random or not just isolated into this group and that group, but really you described it as the attacks on President Trump are designed to undermine, delegitimize, and ultimately remove him. And it's not politics as usual, but instead political warfare at an unprecedented level. So what do you mean by that?
I think the point of the memo, first off, the memo was drafted in a personal capacity. It was something that, having been affiliated with the Trump campaign, I wrote at home and was written to disseminate among colleagues that I'd served on the campaign with. I was one of Trump's counterterrorism advisors during the campaign, and I think there was a over focus on the part of the administration on the media fight. The whole hashtag fake news, and there wasn't enough detailed analysis as to going on as to why phenomenologically it was taking place. And I really wanted to explain to them how Trump's opposition, or people who perceived a risk in what President Trump was trying to accomplish in terms of his financial policy, his foreign policy, his national security policy, why they would be behind a campaign that we saw like this. I think everybody would agree that in the past, at least in my 40-something years of life, I've never seen anything like it, where just every night it just is incessant. You couldn't turn on the radio, the television, or turn on your Twitter feed without seeing it. And I was trying to give them some context as to why this would be taking place.
Okay. And again, folks, if you just tune in, this is Rich Higgins, and we're speaking with, and there's a memo he wrote, which you can read. I put a link up to it on americacanwetalk.org, and I think it's on our Facebook page too, America Can We Talk. And what was so, it's just really, you have to, and I'm pretty wonky, and I'm a lawyer by background. I had to read it several times to begin to grasp the depth of it. But one point that I want to follow up with you talked early on in the memo about the idea that you used the expression cultural Marxism, and you also talked about how these campaigns against President Trump work through narratives. And you said that because the hard left is aligned with Islamic organizations, and then you talked about Antifa, working with Muslim Brotherhood, doing business as CARE, and the national organizations like ACLU and Black Lives Matter working together with CARE. I think so many people see each of those groups as isolated groups with a singular issue, and you're mixing their motives together. Can you explain why?
I think it's really important to understand that they share a common end state, which is the weakening and disenfranchisement of the core American political philosophy, where the individual is the sovereign. You see both the Democrats and the Republican establishment now working to overturn the results of an election of an individual who's brought into power to begin to change what we'd seen as in the course of the past, I'd say probably 50, 60 years, but really the past three administrations, going back to 1992, maybe you could go even earlier to the New World Order with the Bush administration, the first one. But the point of it being, these groups are aligned at the end state level. All of them wanted to see President Trump diminished. All of them were opposed to the idea of an America revived, right? And Trump ran on Make America Great Again as an American revival movement. That's what he was about, bringing back production capitalism, stopping these unfair trade deals, being smarter on national security, where we just have these perpetual wars. And we see the establishment now, both on the left and right, beginning to get success, where, they've continued the war in Afghanistan, which, it seems like we're in now tomorrow's the anniversary of 9/11. We're 16 years into this war with no end in sight. And I think the American people want us to be smarter, and they want us to have strategies that actually result in the benefit, for the benefit of the country, as opposed to the benefit of these special interest groups. So it's their shared objective that really unites them. And we see that, as far as the Islam thread, they identified back as early as, candidly, I said in the memo, the 1980s, but in reality, Saeed Qutb, the core ideological founder of Al-Qaeda, studied in Colorado in 1949 and 1950. And he began to make these assessments as he was formulating some of his core doctrines back in the 50s and 60s. So this alliance, if you will, between the hard left Marxists and the jihadis is nothing new. For people who've really taken the time to study the ideological and doctrinal drivers behind the enemy's movement, it's common knowledge. But the average American is fed by the media this fixation simply on the violent side of the effort. They don't really get into the political and ideological side of it.
Okay, so if you do get into the political and ideological side of it, so you begin to see, and I have to, I'm going to step back and say, you made a comment in this that people who got behind Donald Trump, he really tapped into, your expression, a deep vein of concern among many citizens that America is at risk and is slipping away. And I think that is a beautiful summary of what I'm going to guess the majority of Trump voters saw, especially those who had not voted in 20 or more years, who turned out for the first time. They found someone, whether they did or did not like his brusque, his speaking style, his whole demeanor is very unique for a serious national level candidate. But they heard someone like tapping into their heart. They're concerned about, yes, I feel that way too. Part of it was he was able to call out and talk about issues that people had been beaten down by political correctness into thinking, you can't talk about that. You can't say that at all. So he really did revive all that. But, I cannot commend you highly enough for the depth of this memo and how helpful it was. But so where does all of this, you talk about all these groups who are churning behind the scenes and upset about Trump's victory. Like, what does that mean for, suppose that, and we're going to have to get to break here. I have a minute and a half before the break. But let me just go this way. At an individual level, you talk about the idea, people start to feel afraid to speak up. They're afraid of being labeled sexist, racist, xenophobic. And it is a tactic. You talk about it's a tactic, not just a circumstantial thing. In about a minute, is it accurate that people, all these labels are flying around, that they're tactics used to silence people?
It is part of a coordinated plan today being employed by the jihadi groups and the Islamic fundamentalists. But I can show you testimony from people like Bella Dodd back in 1953 to the House Un-American Activities Committee, talking about how Marxists would use terms like racist and fascist. And we see, groups like Antifa. Antifa is a group that has, while new on the American political scene, it was dominant in 1932 and 1933 Germany. And the Nazi groups rose in opposition to these communist groups. And we need to understand how these political mass movements interact with one another. And I don't think we have a sufficient focus in terms of national security on the domestic threat that these groups represent, in terms of their ability to shape narratives and to shape the public's perception of events. And I think it's a real danger, and it's the reason I authored the memo is I didn't feel like we were understanding what was happening to the president.
Yeah, Rich Higgins, we're going to zip off to a break. When I come back, I want to have you tell us what cultural Marxism means. And welcome back to America Can We Talk. If you're just tuning in, we have on the line with us this evening Rich Higgins, who is just a deeply thoughtful and long experienced in the military background, studying the ideology of war, just very insightful guy. And the memo that he wrote, he was formerly on the National Security Council and working with H.R. McMaster, our National Security Advisor, and he is no longer in that job. And I'm going to get to that in a moment. But the memo he wrote called POTUS and Political Warfare really lays out the idea that it's important to recognize that what is happening in the multi-pronged attacks on President Trump and really on America are not isolated, and they have common ideological roots. So it's vital to understand them. And, I want to just ask you about one term you use, and I mentioned earlier in the show I want to start talking about this more. You use the term cultural Marxism. What does that mean to you?
The simplest way to explain it is if in my past life, I work in the black side of government activities overseas. But if you want to take out a country, you had four principal target groups that you went after. They were students and youth, labor groups, media, and elites. And the goal of your influence operations inside of those spaces was to move them into your perception of events, to move them into your understanding of the rule of law, your understanding of international governance in favor of U.S. foreign policy. So when I say the term cultural Marxism, it was the same thing executed, really under the rubric of the Soviet Union to begin with, but today carried on in groups like the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe, the United Nations, and others, where they make extra-legal or extraterritorial claims of jurisdiction on specific subjects here inside the United States. So, for example, when the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is funding Harvard, they're funding Georgetown, they're funding all of the elite universities in the United States and providing for them and the elite students that are attending these universities who will someday staff our government and staff our corporations with a concocted or contrived version of the jihadi threat. And so, when you get into cultural Marxism, and you can go deep into the Soviet underpinnings of it, but it also is reflective of a nihilistic or a belief in everything that is the belief in nothing that is pushed forward into our youth culture today through popular media, etc. So it's a line of attack. It's nonviolent in its nature, but in fact it's extremely violent because it's the destruction of the faith in your own system. And I think that's. If you ask me, the most dangerous problem facing the United States today, it's that. An example of it would be, and in the paper I included a quote talking about this concept of liberating tolerance. But it's this liberating tolerance concept which would have the president condemning the white supremacists, the KKK, and the Nazis in Charlottesville, but not being allowed to condemn Antifa and the leftist agitators who are actually conducting the violence in Charlottesville. It was the split notion of tolerance. While we had to tolerate the communist violence there, we could not tolerate the right wing's violence there. The thing I really like about President Trump is he's non-ideological. He's a true American. He believes in reason and critical thinking. I think that cultural Marxism seeks to drive both sides into ideological camps to split the society. And that's the simplest way I think I can explain it to people. You can go and, for people who are, interested in studying it more, you can study Gramsci and they can study the Frankfurt School. And, after the communists were chased out of Germany in the 1930s, they came here and they set up the Frankfurt School where they began to infiltrate U.S. institutions. And in the paper, in one of the footnotes, I actually linked to a video archive where a Canadian media organization was interviewing a former KGB officer named Bezmenov, who ran their influence operations campaign. And he talks about how they went about setting up their cultural Marxist influence programs.
Okay, that was just fabulous. Thank you for that answer. And I have to tell you that, just stepping back a minute, I feel like we were just talking in the break. Actually, I'm a round table here, Mari Sullivan, Jenny McGarry, and we were talking in the break about how we, on the one hand, we observe everything you're talking about here and just all of this happening in America, and we just feel like, it just seems like a big conglomerate and ugly and sinister and beneath the surface attack. And on the other hand, I think there's a lot of a core of America that's not buying it, that is just saying, this isn't our country. And, so, I don't know if you agree with that, but I feel like I'm so glad what you wrote, but I feel excited about the idea. I think there's still a core of American appreciation of our history, our culture, our identity as a country, that it's not flying as well as the leftists would hope. Would you agree with that?
I do agree with that. I think there are a lot of vestiges left of, the true vision of America. Everything from Little League baseball to the Boy Scouts to the homeschooling movement. I mean, and the family tradition. I mean, I learned a lot of what I know. My grandfather was a World War II vet. He taught me about America. My father's a Vietnam era guy. Same thing. It's passed down familially. And I think that, despite what popular culture is trying to do, hopefully, and I think the election of President Trump is reflective of this, there is the desire to create a restored belief in America as founded as a republic, not at perpetual war, with an economic nationalist interest that looks out for production capitalists and the working class. And I hope we can get back to that. You have the globalist narrative that is pushed upon us almost every day. But I think the American people see through that, and I hope that their continued participation at the ballot box reflects that, because, to take the country back, it's going to require more than just one presidential cycle. This movement has to be sustainable, and I hope that we're right about that.
I do too. Also, Rich, I want to ask you this. So you wrote this memo. It ended up in H.R. McMaster's hands and ultimately ended up in President Trump's hands. And at least was reported that President Trump loved the memo. He was right on board, and H.R. McMaster decided that he didn't need you on the National Security Council any longer. But let me ask you this. What would you have said if McMaster said, my gosh, you're right, you're brilliant, and Trump said that? What do you do about this if you are the strategist trying to push back?
I think there are a couple things that, they're simple to say but harder to do. First off, we have to reintegrate civics education, and we have to take back the public school system. The public school system today is just an absolute mess. I say this as a person with two daughters currently being indoctrinated, and then every night they come home and I have to kind of wash off the indoctrination. Yeah. I think that's one very simple but hugely important thing to do. Second, we need to encourage a more competitive media environment. And I don't know exactly how you do that. Third, and I think it's, talk about something simple to do. How about just a return to teaching Marxist and Islamist ideology? I mean, it's just frankly not being taught to our analysts in the intelligence community and the national security space today. I don't have discussions with people in my own age group. I was tutored by guys and mentored by guys who are now all in their 70s. Who fought the Cold War, who fought ideological wars in the past. And I think that they provided for me a skill set that allows me to be able to see this. Unfortunately, there aren't many colleagues in my age group that understand this stuff. And certainly the guys coming up behind me have been completely devoid of any experience with this stuff. So there are some simple things that can be done. As far as how the memo got to the president, or even if it did, I can't confirm all that. I don't know for a fact it happened. I never shared it with anybody with the intent of it reaching the president. The fact that it did is quite flattering. I think the reaction by H.R. McMaster and his deputy Rick Waddell reflects their own concerns on where they fall in terms of their understanding of what's happening to the president. I just think that we have an entire cadre now of general officers and senior political leaders inside the government who have, they've aligned themselves with these globalist ideologies and were promoted certainly under Obama and probably under the Bush administration. So you have, a generational ideological issue in your general officer and senior ranks inside the government right now. And, that is a true national security crisis where, the government no longer feels that it's ideologically supportive of the American people's wishes. And I think that really troubles me about what I see happening today.
The fact that, I don't know whether President Trump really read it, but the fact that it's been out there so much, I'm going to guess probably every member of the National Security Council, most of the upper administration level people in the White House, Trump, many people have read it. And honestly, I think what your memo really does help people do is get beyond the day-to-day news, the day-to-day story, the day-to-day issue. Now we're trying to figure out what about to do with transgenders in the military, what to do about the border security or the Dreamers. It helps them think of America in bigger pictures, in a bigger picture, and then also recognize the undermining of America is, if anything else, it is the job of the federal government to preserve and protect America. And so I think it's probably done fabulous good, and so actually, I want to ask you one thing quickly about McMaster. I have a minute left, but do you have any sense of whether he read this and just decided that's crazy, this is completely off, or did he decide, I don't want the country or the people thinking I think this, or I want to put my head in the sand, I don't want to deal with this reality? Do you have any idea if he embraces what you were writing about?
I'm absolutely sure he does not embrace it. I know he read it. He never asked me into his office to speak about it or anything like that. As soon as he saw it, he immediately moved to have me, exfiltrated from the National Security Council. And that's fine by me. Candidly, the fact that the memo has received such wide distribution, I could not have done more for the country serving in the National Security Council for 10 years. If 10 or 20 million people read the memo, then I will have done more than I could have ever hoped to accomplish for the country.
Rich Higgins, you are a national gem. So, first of all, thank you so much for calling. It was fabulous to talk with you tonight, and I'd love to have you on again sometime. I just thank you so much for your efforts on behalf of America and for writing this memo.
All right, Debbie. Hey, God bless.